Get ready to dive into a heart-stopping thriller. A millionaire is brutally attacked by thieves, and Keanu Reeves' unexpected move defies all logic. Detective Li Ming's hands trembled as she aimed her service pistol at the figure across the dimly lit warehouse. The beam of her flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing the face that had haunted her for 15 years. "Don't move," she commanded, her voice steadier than she felt. "Put your hands where I can see them." Keanu Reeves, older now, grayer, but unmistakable, slowly raised his hands. His eyes, once so familiar, regarded her with a mixture of recognition and resignation. "Hello, Li Ming," he said softly. "I knew you'd find me eventually." The warehouse fell silent except for the distant sound of raindrops hammering against the metal roof. 15 years of questions, of sleepless nights and cold case files had led to this moment. Outside, sirens wailed as backup approached, but they seemed to exist in another world entirely. "You know why I'm here," Li Ming said, struggling to maintain her professional detachment. The weight of her badge felt suddenly heavy against her chest. Keanu nodded slowly. "Because of May." The name hung in the air between them like a physical thing. Mei Zhang, Li Ming's younger sister, Keanu's high school girlfriend, missing and presumed dead since that summer night in 2009. "I didn't kill her, Li Ming." She tightened her grip on the gun. "Then where is she? What happened that night?" A crash from the back of the warehouse made them both flinch. Footsteps approached rapidly, backup arriving too soon. Li Ming knew that once other officers flooded, in this fragile moment of truth would shatter. Keanu's eyes darted toward a metal door behind him. "There's something you need to see first, something I've been protecting." His voice dropped to a whisper. "Something that will change everything you think you know." Li Ming felt a chill that had nothing to do with the damp warehouse air. 15 years of police work had taught her to recognize when someone was telling the truth. And despite everything, despite the evidence and the suspicions that had driven her career, she believed him. She made a decision that violated every protocol she'd sworn to uphold. Lowering her gun slightly, she nodded toward the metal door. "Show me." Meadow Creek had always been the kind of small town where people claimed nothing bad ever happened. Nestled in the foothills of the Cascade Mountains, its picturesque downtown and friendly neighbors featured in tourism brochures throughout the Pacific Northwest. Growing up there, the Chen sisters knew better. As one of the few Asian American families in town during the 1990s, they experienced the subtle discrimination that lurked beneath Meadow Creek's wholesome veneer. Their parents, hard-working immigrants who owned the town's most popular restaurant, shielded them as best they could, encouraging excellence and resilience in equal measure. Amara, the older sister by 4 years, embraced this approach with determination. Straight-A student, track team captain, and fiercely protective of her more free-spirited younger sister. Sophie, meanwhile, rebelled against the weight of expectations. Beautiful and charismatic but troubled, she sought escape in art, in parties, and eventually in Daniel Reeves. Daniel was the quiet son of the town's sheriff, a scholarship student, with exceptional grades and a passion for astronomy. Most parents would have approved, but Sheriff Reeves carried his own prejudices. He made his disapproval of Daniel's relationship with Sophie abundantly clear, both at home and throughout the town. The summer after Sophie's high school graduation hummed with possibility and tension. She had deferred college acceptance to pursue her art, much to her parents' dismay. Amara, home from her second year at the police academy, tried to mediate the increasingly volatile family dynamics. Meanwhile, Daniel prepared to leave for MIT with a prestigious physics scholarship. Then came the night of June 18, 2009. Amara remembered every detail with painful clarity. The thunderstorm that knocked out power across town, the frantic call from Daniel just before midnight, his voice barely audible over the static. "Sophie's gone. We were at the Overlook and I can't find her." What followed was chaos. Sheriff Reeves taking control of the investigation, search parties combing the forests and riverbanks, and ultimately blood evidence found in Daniel's car. Not enough to prove murder, but enough to cast suspicion. Daniel's story remained consistent throughout the investigation. He and Sophie had argued about their future at Meadow Creek Overlook. She'd stormed off into the woods during the storm. He'd searched for hours before calling for help. Sheriff Reeves had other theories. Without a body, charges weren't filed, but the sheriff made sure everyone in town knew who he believed was responsible. Daniel left for MIT 3 weeks later, his scholarship deferred by a year. The Chen family fractured under the weight of grief and unanswered questions. For Amara, Sophie's disappearance became the defining moment of her life. The reason she pursued detective work with single-minded focus. The cold case she could never let go. She built her reputation solving impossible cases, all while gathering breadcrumbs that might lead back to Daniel Reeves. Over the years, evidence mounted. Daniel's abrupt career changes and relocations, anonymous tips about his whereabouts, and finally, financial transactions that suggested he was funding someone's long-term care. When facial recognition flagged him working at a research facility under a slightly altered name in Portland, just 3 hours from Meadow Creek, Amara knew her moment had arrived. What she hadn't expected was to find him seemingly waiting for her, as though he'd been anticipating this confrontation for 15 years. The metal door opened to reveal a small room with humming medical equipment and a hospital bed. A woman lay there, her face gaunt but hauntingly familiar. Long-term coma. Patient. Amara's detective mind catalogued automatically. Then recognition struck like lightning. "That's impossible," she whispered, moving closer despite herself. The woman's face had aged, but unmistakably belonged to Sophie Chen. "She's been like this since that night," Daniel said quietly, standing in the doorway. "Traumatic brain injury. The doctors said she might never wake up." Amara's mind reeled as she struggled to process what she was seeing. Why? Why keep her hidden? Why let everyone think she was dead? Daniel's expression darkened. "Because your sister didn't fall that night, Amara. She was pushed." Outside, the sound of police officers clearing the main warehouse grew closer. Time was running short. "By whom?" Amara demanded, though part of her already suspected the answer. "By the person who found us at the Overlook, the person who couldn't stand seeing us together." Daniel's voice cracked slightly. "Your sister was planning to expose years of corruption in Meadow Creek, evidence she'd gathered about illegal logging permits, contaminated water, and the officials who looked the other way, including Sheriff Reeves." The pieces began falling into terrible place in Amara's mind. The sheriff's vehemence about Daniel's guilt, the way the investigation had been controlled so tightly, the missing evidence she'd discovered years later. "My father knew about this facility," Daniel continued. "If I'd gone to the hospital that night, he would have made sure Sophie never received treatment. So I made a choice." He gestured around the room. "I've spent 15 years protecting her, using my research salary to pay for her care, living under the radar. I couldn't risk coming forward until I had proof." "What proof?" Amara asked, her detective instincts cutting through the emotional fog. Daniel pulled a weathered journal from his jacket. "Sophie's documentation of everything, including a recorded conversation with your father from that night. I've been gathering additional evidence ever since, building a case strong enough that even Sheriff Reeves couldn't escape it." Amara reached for the journal with unsteady hands, but before she could take it, the door behind them burst open. 2 uniformed officers entered with weapons drawn. "Detective Chen, step away from the suspect," one commanded. Daniel's eyes met Amara's in silent question. For 15 years, she had pursued justice for her sister, imagining it would come in the form of Daniel's arrest. Now, in an instant, everything had changed. Her next decision would determine whether justice would finally be served, and at what cost. "Lower your weapons," she said firmly, turning to face her colleagues. "This is a protected witness in an ongoing investigation into corruption and attempted murder." She flashed her badge. "I need this scene secured and the patient stabilized for transport." The officers hesitated, confusion evident on their faces. "That's an order," Amara added with all the authority she could muster. And get me the FBI on the phone. This just became a federal case. In the hours that followed, Amara's career hung in precarious balance. She orchestrated Sophie's transfer to Portland Memorial Hospital under guard, processed Daniel's evidence through proper channels, and made the call she'd been dreading for 15 years to her parents, who had never stopped lighting incense, for their missing daughter. Former Sheriff Reeves, now retired and still influential in Meadow Creek, was brought in for questioning by federal agents. The case against him built rapidly as Daniel's careful documentation provided leads that confirmed Sophie's original findings. Decades of corruption began unraveling across 3 counties. Throughout it all, Amara struggled with her own complicity. Had her single-minded focus on Daniel blinded her to the truth? Had her reverence for law enforcement made her unable to see corruption within its ranks? The detective who prided herself on finding truth had been pursuing the wrong suspect for 15 years. 1 week after the warehouse confrontation, Amara sat alone by Sophie's hospital bed, the soft beeping of monitors keeping time with her thoughts. The doctors were cautiously optimistic about Sophie's condition now that she was receiving advanced treatment, though they warned the road to potential recovery would be long. "I'm sorry it took me so long to find you," Amara whispered, holding her sister's motionless hand. "But I'm here now and I'm not going anywhere." She didn't notice Daniel standing in the doorway until he cleared his throat softly. "The federal prosecutor wants to meet tomorrow," he said. "They're offering immunity in exchange for testimony." Amara nodded without looking up. "You should take it." "I never wanted any of this, Amara. I just wanted to keep her safe until I could prove what happened." When she finally met his gaze, Amara saw not the villain she'd constructed in her mind for 15 years, but a man who had sacrificed everything to protect someone he loved. "You did," she acknowledged simply. A nurse entered with medication, interrupting the moment. "Her brain activity has been increasing," she mentioned casually. "It's a promising sign." After the nurse left, an uncomfortable silence stretched between them. 2 people connected by love for the same person, separated by years of suspicion and secrets. "Did you ever consider coming to me?" Amara finally asked. "All those years. I was looking for you. Did you ever think about trusting me with the truth?" Daniel's expression revealed the weight of 15 years of isolation. "Every day. But your father made it clear what would happen if I did." He hesitated. "And after a while, I saw how your career was built around finding me. How could I take that purpose away from you?" The statement struck Amara like a physical blow. Had her identity become so entwined with this case that she'd been unable to see beyond it? Before she could respond, a slight pressure against her palms stopped her breath. Sophie's fingers had twitched, a tiny movement but unmistakable. 3 months later, Meadow Creek looked much the same as it always had. The same mountain views, the same quaint storefronts, the same community board packed with notices for local events. But beneath the surface, everything had changed. Former Sheriff Reeves awaited trial on multiple charges, including attempted murder and corruption. The environmental damage he had helped conceal was being addressed by state authorities. And in the small courtroom of the county courthouse, the final deposition in the case was about to begin. Amara sat stiffly in the front row, watching as judicial aides prepared the room. Her career had survived, though barely. The FBI had recognized her actions at the warehouse as necessary under the circumstances, but her superiors had been less forgiving of protocol violations. She now worked cold cases exclusively, with heightened supervision. The side door opened, and Sophie entered, in a wheelchair pushed by Daniel. Though still thin and fragile, 3 months of intensive therapy had yielded remarkable progress. She could communicate through simple words and gestures, her cognitive abilities returning gradually but steadily. The siblings' eyes met across the room. In Sophie's gaze, Amara saw not accusation for the years of mistruth, but the same, fierce spirit that had always defined her younger sister. Sophie raised a hand in greeting, a movement that had taken weeks of physical therapy to accomplish. As the deposition began, Sophie's halting testimony confirmed everything Daniel had protected for 15 years. She described confronting Sheriff Reeves with evidence of corruption, his violent reaction at the overlook, and her final memory of falling through darkness as thunder crashed overhead. When the prosecutor asked why she hadn't shared her investigation with her sister, Sophie's eyes found Amara's again. Protecting, she managed, the word slurred but understandable. Amara, future. The statement broke something open inside Amara. The realization that, while she had spent 15 years believing she was pursuing justice for her sister, Sophie had originally kept her in the dark to protect her career prospects in law enforcement. Each sister had tried to protect the other, and in doing so had lost years together. When the judge called a recess, Amara found herself standing outside the courthouse, gulping fresh air. Daniel joined her, keeping a respectful distance. "She doesn't blame you, you know," he said quietly. "She should," Amara replied. "I was so certain I knew what happened, so convinced I was right." "You were doing what you thought was right with the information you had," Daniel countered. "We all were." A silence fell between them, not comfortable but no longer charged with 15 years of suspicion. "The doctors say she might regain up to 80% of her cognitive function eventually," Daniel continued. "She's already exceeding their expectations." Amara studied him, seeing clearly for the first time the toll the years had taken. "What will you do now, after the trial?" Daniel shrugged. "I've been offered my position back at the research facility. Beyond that," he trailed off, leaving unspoken the question of his place in Sophie's future. The courthouse door opened, and Sophie wheeled herself out with determined pushes. She maneuvered until she faced both of them, her expression resolute despite her physical limitations. "Family dinner," she said with careful enunciation. "Both come." Amara felt tears threatening. In those simple words, her sister was offering what seemed impossible: forgiveness, reconciliation, a path forward together. When she glanced at Daniel, she saw he was equally moved. In that moment, standing in the shadow of the courthouse where truth was finally emerging, Amara recognized that justice wasn't always what she had imagined it to be. Sometimes it was messy and complicated, woven with loss and redemption in equal measure. "I'd like that," she said softly, and realized she meant it. The Chen family restaurant closed early on Sunday evenings for family meals, a tradition that had survived decades of change. Tonight, the private dining room held more history than usual. Amara arrived last, carrying case files, not Sophie's but others, cold cases waiting for resolution, families waiting for answers. She set them aside as she entered, greeted by the familiar sense of her parents' cooking and the unfamiliar sight of Daniel helping Sophie with her physical therapy exercises by the window. Her parents moved differently now, lighter somehow, as if Sophie's return had restored something essential. They had weathered the media attention, the community's mixed reactions, and the painful revelations about trusted authorities with quiet dignity. "Just in time," her father called, bringing out the final dishes. As they gathered around the table, the reunited family and the man who had sacrificed everything to make it possible, Amara noticed Sophie watching her intently. "New case?" Sophie asked, gesturing toward the files Amara had brought. Amara nodded. "A 20-year disappearance. Everyone gave up, but the sister never stopped looking. She'll find answers," Sophie said with certainty, her speech improving weekly with therapy. Determined. Their eyes met in shared understanding. The road ahead remained challenging: Sophie's ongoing recovery, the completion of Sheriff Reeves's trial, the gradual healing of a community built on secrets. But for the first time in 15 years, they were facing it together. Daniel raised his glass in a tentative toast to finding our way back. As Amara lifted her own glass, she realized that sometimes justice wasn't found in handcuffs or courtrooms. Sometimes it lived in hospital rooms and family dinners, in forgiveness offered and accepted, in truths finally spoken after years of silence. The weight of silence had nearly destroyed them all, but in breaking it, they had found their way home.